The phone shattered against the tile floor, and Elara Voss didn't even flinch. She just stared at the cracked screen, at the email notification frozen in the spiderweb of broken glass, and felt the last thread of her patience snap. Rejected. Again. That was the third major contract Voss Atelier had lost in 4 months, and she was standing in a bathroom at her own birthday party trying not to cry into a sink full of cheap soap. If you've ever felt like giving up right before everything changed, stay with me till the end of this one. You won't regret it. And if stories like this hit different for you, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss what happens next. Let's get into it. She could hear them outside on the rooftop, Jiwoo laughing too loud, Marco arguing with the waiter about the cake, Sumin telling a story Elara had already heard a dozen times. They were her people. Her tiny, stubborn, underpaid people who believed in a 3-person design studio that was slowly bleeding out in a converted warehouse near Gamcheon Culture Village. And she was supposed to go back out there, raise a glass of soju, and pretend that turning 29 in a foreign country with a dying business was something worth celebrating. Elara splashed cold water on her face, picked up the broken phone, and walked back out into the salt air and string lights of Haeundae Beach stretching below them like a black mirror. To Elara, Sumin shouted, shoving a glass into her hand. 29 and still the most stubborn woman in Busan. Most stubborn and most broke, Jiwoo added, and everyone laughed because it was true, and because laughing was easier than admitting they were all terrified. Elara forced a smile and raised her glass. To building something real, she said, and her voice cracked on the word real, just slightly. Just enough that Sumin noticed but didn't say anything. Even if it takes forever. She drank. The soju burned. The ocean wind cut through her thin jacket. And then the rooftop elevator chimed. The metal doors slid open. And every single conversation at the table died. The man who stepped out looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper. Charcoal suit, no tie, watch that probably cost more than Elara's entire year of rent. He scanned the plastic chairs and paper lanterns with an expression that wasn't quite discomfort, but wasn't quite ease either, like someone who had been ordered to do something unusual and had decided to simply comply. "Is that a celebrity?" Jiwoo whispered. The man walked straight to Elara. He stopped, gave a slight bow that was formal but not stiff, and said, "Elara Voss? I'm Daehyun Park. Professor Yoon sent me." The silence that followed was so complete that Elara could hear the ocean 3 stories below. Daehyun Park, chairman of Hanul Corporation, one of the most powerful conglomerates in South Korea. His face was on magazine covers, on financial news tickers, on the sides of buildings Elara walked past every morning. He was not supposed to be standing on a rooftop in Haeundae, holding a small wrapped box, and looking at her like she was a puzzle he hadn't quite solved yet. "Professor Yoon sent you," Elara repeated, because her brain had stopped functioning, and repeating words was the only thing it could manage. "He said you were the most talented person he'd mentored in 20 years, Daehyun said," and his voice was calm, almost dry, like he was reading a memo rather than delivering a compliment that made Elara's chest tighten. "He also said I owed him a birthday favour. I don't ask questions when my uncle makes requests." He held out the small box. Elara opened it with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Inside was a vintage brass compass, heavy and warm, the kind of object that felt like it had survived something. "He told me to tell you this," Daehyun said. "Direction matters more than speed." Elara looked up at him. He was already glancing at his watch, already mentally halfway back to whatever world he'd descended from. And something in her, something tired and sharp and unwilling to be dismissed, made her say, "Did you want to stay for cake, Chairman Park, or was this purely a delivery?" The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, almost. "I think the delivery is complete," he said, and then he walked back to the elevator and disappeared as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving Elara holding a compass she didn't understand and a feeling she couldn't name. So-min grabbed her arm the second the elevator doors closed. What? Just happened? "I have absolutely no idea," Elara whispered. The next morning hit her like a freight train. She walked into Voss Atelier's warehouse office with the compass in her pocket and a headache behind her eyes, and Jiwoo was already waving a tablet in her face before she'd even set down her coffee. Hanul Corporation just announced the Gyeongwon Grand renovation, Jiwoo said, breathless. The actual Gyeongwon Grand, the 1920s hotel in central Busan, the one that's been abandoned for a decade. They're opening it to competitive bids. Elara took the tablet. She read the project brief once, then twice, then a third time, and with each reading her pulse climbed higher. The guidelines were specific and unusual. They didn't want a demolition and rebuild. They didn't want glass towers and infinity pools grafted onto a historic shell. They wanted preservation. They wanted the building's soul kept intact, while the guest experience was reimagined from the inside out. This was Voss Atelier's entire philosophy. This was the thing Elara had built her tiny, struggling studio around. The belief that spaces had memories, and a designer's job was to listen before they drew. "We're entering," she said. Marco nearly choked on his coffee. "Elara, there are 500 design firms in this country. 4 of them have more employees than we have chairs." "I said we're entering," and they did. For 2 weeks, the warehouse became a war zone of fabric swatches, architectural blueprints, and empty takeout containers stacked like monuments to sleep deprivation. Elara visited the abandoned Gyeongwon Grand alone at dusk, walking through empty ballrooms where her footsteps echoed off cracked mosaic floors, running her fingers along hand-carved wooden banisters that hadn't been touched in years. She found a faded photograph in the old manager's office, a couple dancing under chandeliers in 1937, and she built her entire lobby concept around that single image, that single frozen moment of joy in a building that had since been left to rot. She submitted the proposal at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, collapsed on the studio floor, and slept for 14 hours straight. Then the shortlist dropped, and everything exploded. 5 firms. 4 of them were industry giants with glass offices and international portfolios. The 5th was Voss Atelier, a 3-person studio operating out of a converted warehouse that smelled like old wood and desperation. The design world lost its mind. Elara attended the shortlist presentation at Hanul Corporation headquarters, sitting in a conference room with glass walls and a city skyline view, surrounded by firm directors who were old enough to be her parents and who looked at her the way you'd look at a child who'd accidentally wandered into a corporate boardroom. She presented her vision with steady hands and a voice that didn't shake, and she told herself that the work would speak for itself. She was wrong. The journalist caught her in the lobby on the way out. Sharp eyes, sharper smile, a recorder already running. "Ms. Voss, is it true you have a personal relationship with Chairman Park?" Elara stopped walking. "I met him once, at a birthday party." The journalist's expression said she didn't believe a single word. "And Professor Yoon, your university mentor, is his uncle. You'd call that a coincidence?" "I'd call it a small world." 48 hours later, the internet had turned her life into a conspiracy theory. Forums, blogs, industry comment sections, all of them buzzing with the same poisonous narrative. Voss Atelier's shortlist spot was a favour. The foreign girl with the tiny studio had slept or schemed her way to the top. Chairman Park was pulling strings for his uncle's favourite student. The word merit didn't appear once in any of the articles. The word connection appeared in all of them. Elara sat in her darkened office reading the comments until her eyes burned. Someone had posted a photo of her at the Hanul presentation with the caption, "Daddy's New Project," and she felt something inside her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with professional disappointment and everything to do with the specific suffocating pain of having your labour erased by assumption. She called Soo-min at midnight, her voice barely holding together. "I'm thinking about withdrawing." "Don't you dare." "They think I cheated, Soo-min. They think everything I built is a lie because one man showed up at my birthday party uninvited." "People are going to talk no matter what you do," Soo-min said, and her voice was fierce through the static of the phone line. "The question is whether you let their noise drown out your work. What if their noise drowns out the client's trust in me? Then you fight louder." Elara hung up and stared at the compass on her desk. Direction matters more than speed. She didn't know what direction she was supposed to take, but she knew that quitting was the wrong one. The message from Dae-hyun came 3 days later. Not a text, not an email. A handwritten note delivered to the studio by a courier, which felt absurdly formal and entirely in character. He requested a private meeting. Elara almost refused. Her pride was a living thing at that point, snarling and wounded, and the idea of sitting across from the man whose mere existence had detonated her reputation made her stomach turn. But she thought of Professor Yoon, of the compass, of the stubbornness that had carried her across an ocean to a city where she knew no one, and she agreed. The tea house sat in the hills above Busan, all wood and stone and rain streaming down the windows. Dae-hyun was already there when she arrived, sitting perfectly still with a cup of tea in front of him, and the first thing Elara noticed was that he looked tired. Not the polished, camera-ready fatigue of a CEO managing a crisis, but something deeper, something that lived behind his eyes. "If you're here to manage the damage," Elara said before she'd even sat down, "I don't need your help." "I'm not here to manage anything," he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that made her stop mid-sentence. "I'm here to remove myself." She sat down slowly. "What does that mean?" "I've formally recused myself from the Gyeongwon Grand Selection Committee, effective this morning." He pushed a document across the table, a press release, already drafted, announcing that an independent panel of architects and historians would now evaluate all 5 proposals blind. No names, no firm identities, just the work, stripped of everything except its own merit. Elara stared at the document. "You stepped down from your own project." "I stepped down from the committee. The project is still Hanul's, but the decision will no longer be mine." He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, his expression was completely open, completely unguarded. "I didn't come here to protect my reputation, Ms. Voss. I came to protect yours. You earned your place on that short list. The only way to prove it is to let the work speak without my shadow over it." The rain hammered the roof. The tea went cold. Elara sat in the silence and felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to respect. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. You showed up at my birthday because your uncle told you to. Why would you sacrifice your authority over a billion-won project for a stranger?" Dae-hyun looked at his teacup for a long moment. "Because my uncle also told me something else. He said I'd spent 10 years building a corporation and forgot how to build trust. He said watching you fight for a 3-person studio with no safety net reminded him of why he got into architecture in the first place." He paused. "I think he was right." The blind review took 3 weeks, and they were the longest 3 weeks of Elara's life. She tried to work on smaller projects, tried to answer emails, tried to pretend that her entire future wasn't hanging from a thread in a conference room she wasn't allowed to enter. She visited Professor Yoon at the university instead, finding him in his cluttered office surrounded by towers of books and half-finished student models, looking exactly the same as he had when she was his student, rumpled, brilliant, and completely unbothered by the chaos around him. "Why did you send him?" she asked, sitting across from him in a chair held together by duct tape and optimism. Professor Yoon smiled the slow, infuriating smile of a man who had already planned 12 moves ahead. "Because I've watched you build something from nothing for 3 years, Elara. And I've watched my nephew forget that business is supposed to serve people, not the other way around." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. "I thought you both needed what the other had." Elara touched the compass in her pocket. "Direction matters more than speed," she murmured. "Now you're getting it," he said, and went back to grading papers as if he hadn't just rearranged 2 people's lives over a birthday cake. The verdict came on a Thursday morning in Hanul Corporation's main auditorium, and Elara walked in with her hands clenched so tightly, her nails left crescents in her palms. The room was packed. Cameras, press, all 5 competing firms, industry executives, the independent review panel, seated at a long table under harsh fluorescent lights. The air tasted like static electricity and held breath. The panel's lead architect stood up. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for being merciless, and when she spoke, the entire room went silent. After a comprehensive blind evaluation of all 5 proposals, the panel has reached a unanimous decision. She clicked a remote, and the results appeared on the massive screen behind her. Elara's vision blurred for a second, then sharpened with violent clarity. Voss Atelier, highest score in historical sensitivity, highest score in guest experience innovation, highest score in sustainability, highest score in emotional resonance, first place across every single category. The room erupted. The other firm directors sat frozen, their expressions cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. The journalists who had written the hit pieces were already scrambling for their phones, desperately constructing new narratives to replace the ones that had just been publicly demolished. The lead architect continued reading. The winning proposal demonstrated a rare understanding that a building is not a canvas. It is a conversation between past and future. The designers listened before they drew. In 30 years of reviewing architectural proposals, I have rarely seen work this honest. Elara couldn't breathe. Jiwoo was crying openly, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. Marco was filming everything on his phone with shaking hands. The auditorium noise swelled around them like a wave, but Elara's eyes had found something in the back of the room. Dae-hyun, standing alone near the exit, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He caught her gaze, held it for one long moment, and gave her a single nod. No smile, no celebration. Just acknowledgement, quiet and absolute, like a man who had never doubted the outcome even when the rest of the world had. Then he turned and walked out before the press could reach him, and Elara stood in the wreckage of every rumour that had tried to bury her, and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd first arrived in Busan 3 years ago. She felt like she belonged. 2 months later, the Gyeongwon Grand was alive again. Scaffolding wrapped the building like a cocoon, construction crews worked in shifts around the clock, and Voss Atelier had grown from 3 people to 8, their new responsibilities expanding to cover the hotel's entire guest experience design. The 1937 photograph Elara had found in the abandoned manager's office was now enlarged and mounted on the ballroom wall, exactly where she'd always envisioned it, and every time she walked past it, she felt the building exhale around her, like something ancient finally being allowed to breathe. Dae-hyun asked her to meet him at the site on a Friday evening. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the scaffolding in shades of gold and copper, and the half-restored ballroom smelled like fresh plaster, and old wood and possibility. He was waiting for her near the grand staircase, and he looked different than he had at the tea house, lighter somehow, as if the weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. He handed her a small envelope without preamble. Elara opened it and found a key inside, brass, heavy, attached to a plain metal ring. "What's this?" she asked. "Office space, top floor of a Hanul-owned building in central Busan. Voss Atelier needs room to grow, and that location has better natural light than your warehouse." He paused and then added, with the faintest trace of amusement, "The lease is market rate, standard terms, no favours. I had my assistant verify that the contract is completely, aggressively ordinary." Elara stared at him. "You're giving me a key and emphasising how boring the lease is?" "I'm giving you a key and emphasising that it comes with no strings," he said, and his voice was steady and deliberate in a way that made her throat tighten. "There's a difference." She looked down at the key in her palm. It was warm from his hand. It was real. It was the most unromantic romantic gesture she had ever received, and she understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that this was the point. He wasn't trying to sweep her off her feet, or rescue her from her struggles, or wrap her in the kind of grand dramatic love that looked beautiful in photographs and collapsed under the weight of real life. He was offering her something harder and rarer and infinitely more valuable: partnership, on her terms, at her pace, with no shadow, no strings, no debt. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. and she didn't try to hide it. They walked out of the hotel together and into the neon-lit streets of Busan, past street food vendors and flickering signs and the distant constant sound of the ocean. They talked about small things, her favourite tile supplier, his catastrophic attempt at cooking kimchi jjigae, Professor Yoon's legendary habit of falling asleep during his own lectures. And Elara realised at some point during the walk that they were moving at exactly the same pace. Not him ahead, leading, not her behind, following, side by side, their footsteps falling in the same rhythm on the wet pavement. She stopped walking. Dae-hyun stopped too, turning to face her under the glow of a neon sign that painted his face in soft blue light. "When you showed up at my birthday," Elara said, "I thought my life was about to become someone else's story." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the tiredness behind his eyes and the steadiness in his posture and the way he had stepped back from his own project to let her stand in the light alone. And she smiled. "Now I think it's still mine," she said. "You're just in it." He smiled back, and it was the first real, unguarded smile she'd ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire face into something warm and human and achingly genuine. They started walking again, side by side, the city stretching out ahead of them, enormous and electric and full of doors that hadn't been opened yet. Behind them, the Gyeongwon Grand's scaffolding glowed softly against the night sky, like a lantern being rebuilt from the inside out. And in Elara's pocket, the brass compass sat warm against her hip, its needle pointing steadily forward. She didn't need him to build her a future. She just needed someone willing to walk beside her while she built it herself. If this story moved you, if you felt Elara's fight in your chest and Dae-hyun's quiet sacrifice in your gut, then do me a favour. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story like this again. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have withdrawn from the competition when the rumours started? Or would you have done what Elara did and let the work speak for itself? I genuinely want to know, and if you made it this far, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories about integrity and earned success still matter, and it helps this channel reach people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching, thank you for staying until the very end, and I'll see you in the next one.